The morning light filtered through the kitchen blinds just like it had for 37 years, painting those same golden stripes across the oak table Caroline and I had picked out at that little furniture store in Millbrook. I sat in my usual chair, the one with the worn armrest where my elbow had rubbed the finish smooth, holding my coffee mug with both hands. Black coffee, no sugar. Caroline used to say I drank it like medicine, but that's how my father taught me. And some things don't change just because the world gets softer. The house was quiet in that particular way houses get when they've been lived in by the same person for too long. Not empty quiet. This place was never empty, not with Caroline's presence still lingering in every corner, but settled quiet, the kind that comes when there's no one left to argue with about the thermostat or which channel to watch during dinner. I'd built this house with my own hands in 1987, every beam and board chosen carefully, every nail driven with purpose. Back then, Ethan was 14, all arms and legs and complaints about having to help his old man on weekends. He'd hold the level while I checked the framing, his young fingers gripping it like his life depended on keeping that bubble centered. Caroline would bring us sandwiches and lemonade, her laugh carrying across the construction site when Ethan inevitably got more sawdust in his hair than on the lumber. Those were the good days, before cell phones and college and Madison, before the silences that stretched between us like unfinished sentences. I reached for the newspaper, still delivered to my front porch every morning, despite Ethan's repeated suggestions that I go digital. The headlines blurred together, politics, weather, another scandal in the state capitol. But I wasn't really reading. My eyes kept drifting to the kitchen counter where Caroline's coffee maker sat, still programmed to brew for two, even though I'd been drinking alone for 3 years now. Some habits die harder than the people who created them. The phone rang at exactly 8:17 a.m. I know because the kitchen clock, another one of Caroline's choices, white porcelain with blue flowers, sat right in my line of sight. Most mornings, the only calls I got were from telemarketers or that nice woman from Dr. Peterson's office reminding me about my annual checkup. But something about this ring felt different, heavier. "Richard Dalton speaking," I answered, my voice carrying that formal tone I'd learned in my Army days and never quite shaken. "Mr. Dalton, this is Jessica Martinez from First National Bank. I'm calling regarding your mortgage account." I set my coffee down slowly, the ceramic making a soft click against the oak. "I'm sorry, there must be some mistake. I don't have a mortgage account with First National. This house was paid off 15 years ago." There was a pause, the kind that comes before bad news gets delivered. I could hear computer keys clicking in the background, the distant murmur of other conversations in what I imagined was a bustling call center. "Sir, I'm showing here that you have an active mortgage on the property at 2847 Maple Ridge Drive, Clearwater. The account was opened 18 months ago for $280,000. I'm calling because you're currently 60 days past due on payments." The room tilted slightly like when you stand up too fast after sitting too long. My grip tightened on the phone receiver, one of those old cordless ones Caroline had insisted on keeping because it feels more substantial than those tiny things everyone carries around now. "That's impossible," I said, though my voice sounded further away than it should have. "I never took out any mortgage. I never signed any papers." More clicking, more silence. Then, "Mr. Dalton, I have your signature right here on the application, dated March 15th, 2022, and your social security number, date of birth. Everything matches our records. The loan was approved for home improvements and debt consolidation. March 15th, 2022. I knew that date, though I couldn't immediately place why. It hung in my memory like a word on the tip of your tongue, familiar but unreachable. "Can you hold for just a moment?" I asked, though I didn't wait for an answer before setting the phone down. I walked to the rollout desk in the corner of the kitchen, where Caroline had always kept our important papers. Everything was still organized exactly as she'd left it. Insurance documents in the blue folder, tax returns in the green one, house papers in the thick manila envelope marked "Home" in her careful handwriting. My hands shook slightly as I pulled out the deed, yellowed with age but clear as the day we'd signed it. Paid in full, lien released, property transferred free and clear to Richard and Caroline Dalton on November 3rd, 2008. I picked up the phone again. "Ma'am, I'm looking at my deed right now. This house has been paid off for 15 years. Whatever documents you have, they're not legitimate." Sir, I understand this is confusing, but I'm required to inform you that if payment isn't received within 30 days, foreclosure proceedings will begin. The total amount currently due is $8,400. Would you like to set up a payment plan? Foreclosure. On the house I'd built with my own hands. On the kitchen where Caroline had made 47 Christmas dinners. On the garage where I'd taught Ethan to change his first tire, and where his old baseball trophies still gathered dust on a shelf I'd installed when he was 12. I need copies of those documents, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. All of them, the application, the signatures, everything. Of course, Mr. Dalton, I can mail those to you, or if you prefer, you can come into the branch to review them in person. I'll be there today. After I hung up, I sat in the silence of my kitchen and tried to make sense of what I'd just heard. Someone had used my name, my information, my identity to borrow nearly $300,000. Someone who knew my social security number, my date of birth, my address. Someone close enough to forge my signature convincingly enough to fool a bank. The coffee had gone cold in my cup, but I drank it anyway, barely tasting the bitterness. Through the window, I could see Mrs. Henderson's cat picking its way across my backyard, pausing to sniff at the rose bushes Caroline had planted the year before she died. Everything looked normal, peaceful even, but underneath that surface calm, something fundamental had shifted. I thought about calling Ethan immediately, but something held me back. Maybe it was the 3 months since we'd last spoken, or the way our conversations had become stilted and brief since Caroline's funeral. Maybe it was the growing distance I'd felt from him ever since he'd married Madison, with her sharp laugh and expensive clothes, and the way she looked at our modest house like she was calculating its square footage. Instead, I walked to my study. Caroline had called it that, even though it was really just a converted bedroom, with built-in bookshelves and an old desk from Goodwill. On the wall hung a photograph of Caroline and me on our wedding day. Her in the simple white dress she'd sewn herself, me in my father's borrowed suit. We looked impossibly young, impossibly hopeful. Next to it was a picture of the three of us from Ethan's high school graduation, his cap sitting crooked on his head, Caroline's arm around his waist, all of us grinning like we had forever ahead of us. I pulled out the photo album Caroline had meticulously maintained, page after page of our life together. There was Ethan at 2, chocolate cake smeared across his face at his birthday party. At 7, holding up a fish he'd caught at the lake house, Caroline's father's old cabin that had been her pride and joy. At 16, standing next to the car I'd helped him rebuild in our garage, grease under his fingernails and satisfaction written across his face. When had things changed? When had my son become someone I needed to suspect? The answer came slowly, like dawn breaking over familiar landscape. It had been gradual, so subtle I'd almost missed it. The way he'd started bringing Madison to every family gathering, even casual dinners. How she'd begun redirecting conversations, speaking for him when he was perfectly capable of speaking for himself. The increasing requests for money, just loans, he'd always said, just until he got back on his feet. And March 15th, 2022. I remembered now. That was the day Caroline's will had been finalized, the day we'd met with the lawyer to ensure everything was in order. Ethan had been there, sitting quietly while the attorney explained the details. Caroline had left him her jewelry, some family heirlooms, and her half of the house would go to me. But the house itself, the property, that would eventually be Ethan's inheritance. Had he grown tired of waiting for her, eventually? I closed the photo album and returned to the kitchen, where the morning light had shifted and the golden stripes now fell across the floor instead of the table. Time had passed without my noticing, the way it does when your world tilts on its axis and you're trying to find your footing again. The drive to First National took 20 minutes through the quiet streets of Clearwater, past the elementary school where Ethan had learned to read, past the park where we'd spent countless Saturday afternoons when he was small. The bank sat in a modern strip mall, all glass and chrome and artificial efficiency. Nothing like the solid brick building where Caroline and I had gotten our first mortgage 4 decades ago, where the bank president knew your name and your father's name, and wouldn't dream of lending you money without looking you in the eye first. Jessica Martinez turned out to be a pleasant woman in her 30s, with kind eyes and the patient manner of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome news. She led me to a small conference room and spread the documents across the table like evidence at a trial. There it was, my signature on page after page. or something that looked like my signature, close enough to pass a cursory inspection, but wrong in ways only I would notice. The R in Richard was too rounded, the D in Dalton too angular. Whoever had forged these had been careful, but not careful enough. The loan was for home improvements and debt consolidation, Ms. Martinez explained, running her finger along the application. It shows here that you wanted to renovate the kitchen and add a new roof, plus pay off some credit card debt. I studied the paperwork. The address was correct, my social security number was right. Even my date of birth matched, but the income listed was wrong, higher than my actual pension and social security payments, by nearly $40,000. And the signature, my supposed signature, dated 18 months ago. Who brought these papers in? I asked. Was I here in person? Ms. Martinez consulted her computer screen. The loan was processed through our digital platform. The documents were notarized and submitted electronically. It's becoming more common, especially since the pandemic. Notarized by whom? She clicked through several screens. A Catherine Mills, Mobile Notary Services. She's certified through the state and has been working with us for several years. I made a mental note of the name. Someone had sat across from this Catherine Mills, claimed to be me, and signed my name to papers that put my home at risk. Someone who knew enough about my life to fill out the application correctly, who had access to my personal information. I need copies of everything, I said, and I need to know what my options are. Ms. Martinez's expression grew more sympathetic. Mr. Dalton, if what you're saying is true, if you didn't sign these documents, then this is identity theft and mortgage fraud. You'll need to file a police report and probably contact an attorney. The bank will need to conduct its own investigation, but in the meantime, the foreclosure proceedings are still scheduled to move forward unless the account is brought current. I felt that familiar tightness in my chest, the same sensation I'd had during my mild heart attack 2 years ago. But this wasn't physical pain. This was the slow, crushing realization that someone I trusted had betrayed me in the most fundamental way possible. Driving home with a manila envelope full of fraudulent documents on the passenger seat, I tried to imagine the conversation I'd need to have with Ethan. How do you ask your own son if he's stolen your house? How do you look the boy you raised, the young man you taught to throw a curveball and drive a stick shift, and ask if he's destroyed your life for money? The house felt different when I walked through the front door, as if the very walls now carried the weight of uncertainty. I went to the garage, where I kept my tools organized on pegboard the way my father had taught me, where every wrench and screwdriver had its place. This was where I'd taught Ethan the satisfaction of fixing things with your hands, of solving problems through patience and the right tool applied at the right moment. On the workbench sat the bottle of whiskey he'd given me for my 70th birthday last year. Unopened, still in its box. I'd never been much of a drinker, especially since my heart troubles, but I'd kept it because it was from him, because despite everything, despite the growing distance and the stilted phone calls, he was still my son. I picked up the bottle and read the label. Jameson, 18 years old, expensive. More than Ethan usually spent on gifts, more than he could really afford on his insurance adjuster's salary. I wondered now where the money had come from. As the afternoon light slanted through the garage windows, falling across tools I'd used to build this life Caroline and I had shared, I made a decision. I would call Ethan. I would give him a chance to explain. But I would also prepare for the possibility that the son I'd raised no longer existed, replaced by someone I didn't recognize, someone capable of forging my signature and stealing my home. The truth, whatever it was, would change everything. Some betrayals can be forgiven, but they can never be forgotten. And some wounds, once opened, never quite heal the same way. I closed the garage door and walked back to the house, the weight of the fraudulent documents heavy in my hand, the weight of coming revelations even heavier in my heart. If you find the story interesting, comment number 1. If you find it sad, comment number 2. The phone call to Ethan went straight to voicemail. His voice, recorded in that carefully modulated tone he'd developed since working in insurance, asked me to leave a message and he'd get back to me as soon as possible. I didn't leave one. Some conversations can't be condensed into 30 seconds of rambling into a machine. Instead, I drove to his house. The subdivision where Ethan and Madison lived was one of those planned communities that had sprouted up on the outskirts of town during the housing boom. Rows of nearly identical houses with vinyl siding, and postage stamp lawns, each one designed to look different enough to maintain the illusion of individuality. Their house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, a colonial revival with black shutters and a red front door that Madison had insisted on, because she'd seen something similar in a home decorating magazine. I pulled into their driveway behind Madison's white SUV, noting the dealer plates that were still temporary after 6 months. Another purchase they probably couldn't afford. Another monthly payment to add to what I was beginning to suspect was a growing pile of debt. Madison answered the door wearing yoga pants and an expression of surprise that seemed just a little too practiced. "Richard, what a nice surprise. Ethan's not home from work yet, but come in, come in." She'd never called me Dad, not even after 5 years of marriage. Always Richard, spoken with the kind of bright politeness that felt like a wall disguised as a welcome mat. The interior of their house was magazine perfect in the way that suggested more money spent on appearance than substance. Everything matched, everything coordinated, from the throw pillows on the beige sectional to the artificial orchids on the glass coffee table. It was beautiful in an impersonal way, like a model home designed to sell a lifestyle rather than shelter a life. "Can I get you something to drink?" Madison asked, gesturing toward the kitchen. "I just made coffee." "That's fine," I said, though I didn't really want coffee. What I wanted was to see my son's face when I asked him about the mortgage documents currently sitting in my truck. Madison moved through her kitchen with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to perform domesticity rather than simply live it. Everything was spotless, organized, expensive. The coffee maker alone probably cost more than Caroline and I had spent on our first month's groceries as newlyweds. "Ethan should be home soon," she said, handing me a mug that felt too delicate in my hands. "He's been working such long hours lately. This promotion has really been demanding." Promotion. This was the first I'd heard of any promotion, but then again, details of Ethan's career had become increasingly vague over the past year. When I asked specific questions, he'd give general answers, deflecting with practiced ease. "How's the new position working out?" I asked, settling into one of the chairs at their dining table. Madison's smile flickered, just for a moment. "Oh, you know how it is. More responsibility, more stress. But the money is better, of course. We're finally able to think about some of the bigger things we've been wanting to do. Bigger things, like taking out a mortgage in my name." I sipped the coffee and waited, studying the photographs that lined their mantelpiece. Most were from their wedding or their honeymoon in Cancun, but there were a few older ones mixed in, including one of Ethan as a teenager, standing in my garage with a wrench in his hand and grease on his cheek, grinning at the camera with the pure satisfaction of having fixed something broken. When had that boy disappeared? When had the son who used to help me repair lawnmowers and change oil become someone who might forge his father's signature for money? "Actually," I said, setting down the mug, "I came by because I need to talk to Ethan about something important, something that came up today." Madison's expression grew cautious. "Is everything all right? You're not having health problems, are you?" "No, nothing like that. It's about some documents, some financial documents that have my name on them but that I never signed." The color drained from Madison's face so quickly I might have missed it if I hadn't been watching carefully. She recovered fast, but not fast enough to hide that initial flash of recognition. "I'm sure it's just some mistake," she said, her voice a little too bright. "You know how banks are with their paperwork? Everything's computerized now, so easy for things to get mixed up." "Maybe," I said, "but this seems pretty specific. Someone used my personal information to take out a mortgage. Someone who knew my social security number, my date of birth, enough details about my life to fool a bank." Madison busied herself wiping down counters that were already clean. "Have you called the bank? I'm sure they can straighten it out." "I just came from the bank. That's where I got copies of the documents." I paused, watching her hands still on the granite countertop. "Including copies of the signatures." The front door opened before she could respond, and Ethan's voice called out from the entryway. "Honey, I'm home. Whose truck is that in the—" He stopped short when he saw me sitting at his dining table, his expression cycling through surprise, concern, and something that might have been resignation. "Dad, I wasn't expecting you." He looked older than his 32 years, tired in a way that went deeper than simple fatigue. His hair was thinning at the temples, and he'd put on weight around his middle, the kind that comes from too many fast food lunches and not enough physical activity. But it was his eyes that struck me most. They held a wariness that hadn't been there when he was younger, as if he was constantly calculating angles and exits. "I tried calling," I said. "Went to voicemail. Sorry, busy day at work." He loosened his tie and glanced at Madison, who was still standing frozen by the counter. Some silent communication passed between them, the kind of wordless exchange that develops between couples who've learned to navigate around uncomfortable truths. "Maybe you should sit down," I said. "We need to talk about something important." Ethan poured himself coffee and took the chair across from me, his movements careful and deliberate. Madison remained standing, her hands gripping the edge of the counter like she needed the support. "What's this about, Dad?" I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the folded papers Ms. Martinez had given me. I spread them across the dining table. The fraudulent loan application, the forged signatures, the documentation of a debt I'd never incurred. "First National Bank called me this morning," I said, my voice steady despite the storm building in my chest. "They said I was behind on mortgage payments for a house that's been paid off for 15 years. Ethan's face went very still, not surprised, not confused, just still, like a man trying not to reveal what he's thinking. Madison made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob. "Dad, I can explain." "Can you?" I interrupted. "Because I've been trying to figure out how someone got hold of my personal information, how someone knew enough about my finances to fill out this application, how someone was able to forge my signature well enough to fool a bank." I leaned forward. "The only people who would have access to all that information are people I trust, people I've helped over the years, people I love." The silence stretched between us, heavy with implications. Madison had tears running down her cheeks now, but she wasn't making any sound. Ethan just stared at the papers, his jaw working like he was chewing words he couldn't quite bring himself to speak. "We were desperate," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. The admission hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd been preparing for it since I'd first seen those forged signatures. Knowing something intellectually and having it confirmed are two different kinds of pain. Desperate enough to steal from your father? It wasn't supposed to be stealing. Ethan's words came faster now, tumbling over each other in the way they used to when he was a child trying to explain away some mischief. "We were going to pay it back, all of it. The promotion I mentioned, it's real, but it hasn't come through yet. Madison's parents are having financial problems, and we'd already borrowed everything we could against my 401k. The house was just sitting there, paid off, all that equity just sitting there." "All that equity," I repeated slowly. "You mean my equity, in my house, that I built with my hands and paid for with 40 years of work." Madison finally found her voice. "We knew you'd never agree to it if we asked. You're so conservative about money, but we were going to pay every penny back before you ever knew about it. Except you didn't pay it back, did you? You're 60 days behind on payments for money you stole using my name." Ethan's face crumpled. The promotion got delayed. Madison's car needed repairs, and her parents needed help with their rent, and there were some medical bills. "Stop." I held up my hand. "Just stop." I gathered the papers and folded them carefully, my hands remarkably steady considering the earthquake happening inside my chest. 3 years since Caroline died. 3 years of me trying to stay connected to the son we'd raised together. 3 years of telling myself that the distance between us was just grief, just the natural evolution of a young man building his own life. I'd been wrong. The distance wasn't grief or growth, it was calculation. While I'd been mourning the loss of my wife and trying to figure out how to live without her, my son had been planning to steal my house. "So what happens now?" Ethan asked, his voice small and uncertain in a way that reminded me of the boy who used to crawl into our bed during thunderstorms. I stood up, pushing the chair back under the table with the same care I'd always taught him to show for other people's belongings. "Now you call the bank and explain that you committed fraud. You arrange to pay back every penny, plus whatever penalties and interest have accrued. And you pray that I don't decide to press charges." "Dad, please!" "I'm not finished." My voice carried the same tone I'd used when he was 16 and had come home 3 hours past curfew reeking of beer. "You also need to understand that this changes everything between us. Everything. Trust isn't something you can glue back together once it's broken this completely. Madison stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "Richard, we're family. Families work through these things. We made a mistake, but we can fix it." I looked at her. This woman my son had chosen over the values Caroline and I had tried to instill in him, and felt something cold settle in my chest. "No," I said quietly. "Family doesn't steal from each other. Family doesn't forge signatures and put each other's homes at risk. What you did isn't a mistake. It's a betrayal." I walked toward the front door, my footsteps echoing in their perfect, empty-feeling house. Behind me, I could hear Madison crying and Ethan saying my name, but I didn't turn around. Some conversations don't have second chances. Outside, the autumn air felt clean after the suffocating atmosphere of their house. I sat in my truck for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, trying to process what had just happened. The son I'd taught to fish and hunt and work with his hands had looked me in the eye and admitted to stealing my house. The boy who used to help me plant Caroline's vegetable garden had forged my signature to feed his own financial desperation. But underneath the hurt and the anger, something else was growing, something harder and more determined. They'd made a mistake if they thought I was just a harmless old man who would quietly absorb this betrayal. They'd forgotten that I'd built my life from nothing, that I'd served my country and raised a family and constructed a business with my own two hands. They were about to learn that stealing from Richard Dalton was a decision they'd regret for a very long time. I started the truck and drove home, already beginning to formulate a plan. Some lessons can only be taught the hard way, and my son was about to get an education in consequences that would last the rest of his life. The war had just begun, but this time, I wasn't going to be the one left standing in the ruins. The drive home from Ethan's house felt longer than usual, each mile weighted with the gravity of what I'd just learned. The familiar streets of Clearwater, the ones I'd driven for decades, where I knew every pothole and stop sign, seemed foreign now, like I was seeing them through different eyes that belonged to a man whose son had just admitted to stealing his house. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the truck for several minutes, engine ticking as it cooled, staring at the home I'd built with my own hands. Every board, every shingle, every piece of trim had been chosen and placed with care. The front porch where Caroline used to sit with her morning coffee, reading seed catalogs and planning next year's garden. The oak tree in the front yard that Ethan had helped me plant when he was 8. Both of us covered in dirt and laughing at some joke I couldn't remember now. How long had he been planning this? How many times had he sat at my kitchen table, eating meals I'd prepared, accepting checks I'd written to help him through rough patches, all while calculating the value of the house around him? Inside, the silence felt different than it had that morning. Not peaceful now, but heavy with betrayal. I went to Caroline's desk in the corner of the living room, where she'd kept our financial records organized in manila folders with her neat handwriting on the tabs. Everything was still exactly as she'd left it when the cancer finally took her. Insurance papers, tax returns, the deed to the house that proved beyond any doubt that it belonged to me alone. I pulled out her address book, its leather cover worn smooth from years of use, and flipped to the letter M. Marcus Henley, attorney at law. Marcus was 10 years older than me, a man who'd practiced small-town law for nearly 5 decades and had handled everything from our wills to property disputes with neighbors. More importantly, he was someone who remembered when a handshake meant something, and when family loyalty wasn't just a phrase people used when it was convenient. The phone rang 4 times before his gravelly voice answered. "Henley Law Office, Marcus speaking." "Marcus, it's Richard Dalton. I need to see you about something urgent." "Richard, good to hear from you. How are you holding up?" His voice carried the gentle concern of someone who'd known Caroline well and understood what her loss had meant to me. "I've been better. Marcus, I think my son has committed mortgage fraud using my identity. I need to know what my options are." There was a pause, the kind that comes when a lawyer's mind immediately starts cataloging the legal implications of what they've just heard. "Jesus, Richard, are you sure? I have copies of the documents. My signature's been forged, and there's a $280,000 mortgage on my house that I never signed for. Ethan just admitted to it. Can you be here in an hour? This isn't something we should discuss over the phone." Marcus's office occupied the second floor of a brick building on Main Street that had housed lawyers, doctors, and dentists for over a century. The stairs creaked under my feet as I climbed them, carrying the manila envelope that now contained the evidence of my son's betrayal. The hallway smelled of old wood and older secrets, the kind of place where people came to clean up the messes life inevitably created. Marcus greeted me at his office door, his silver hair combed back and his handshake still firm despite his 78 years. His office looked exactly as it had when Caroline and I had first consulted him about buying the house. Law books lining the walls, a heavy oak desk scarred by decades of use, and windows that looked out on the street where we'd raised our family. "Sit down, Richard," he said, gesturing to one of the leather chairs across from his desk. "Tell me everything." I laid out the story methodically, the way I'd learned to explain problems to insurance adjusters and building inspectors over the years. The phone call from the bank, the forged documents, the confrontation with Ethan and Madison. Marcus listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "Richard, what your son did is a federal crime. Identity theft, mortgage fraud, forgery. We're talking about serious felony charges. If you press this, he could be looking at 10 to 20 years in prison." The words hit me harder than I'd expected. Prison. My son, the boy I'd taught to ride a bike and throw a curveball, sitting in a cell because he'd stolen from his father. "What if I don't press charges? What are my options?" Marcus consulted his notes. "Well, you could demand that he refinance the loan in his own name, assuming he can qualify. But given what you've told me about his financial situation, that seems unlikely. You could also demand immediate repayment of the full amount, plus penalties and interest. And if he can't pay, then the bank forecloses on your house and you lose everything you've worked for." Marcus leaned forward. "Richard, I've known you and Caroline for 30 years. I've seen how you've sacrificed for that boy, how you've bailed him out of trouble time and again. But this isn't a speeding ticket or a bounce check. He's put your home, your security, your entire future at risk." I stared out the window at the street below, watching ordinary people go about their ordinary days, unaware that everything I'd thought I knew about my family had just crumbled. A young mother pushed a stroller past the courthouse, her toddler pointing excitedly at something I couldn't see. Somewhere, that child still believed his parents would protect him from harm. That family meant safety and love and unconditional support. "There's something else you need to consider," Marcus continued. "If Ethan was willing to do this once, what's to stop him from doing it again? Identity theft isn't usually a one-time thing. It's a pattern of behavior." The truth of that statement settled in my chest like a stone. How many other documents had Ethan forged? How many other debts might surface with my name attached? The mortgage might just be the beginning. "I need time to think," I said finally. "Of course. But, Richard, don't take too long. Every day that passes makes this more complicated. And if Ethan decides to disappear or declare bankruptcy, your options become even more limited." I drove home in a daze, Marcus's words echoing in my head. Federal crime. 10 to 20 years. The boy who used to fall asleep on my lap, watching baseball games, might spend the prime of his life behind bars because he'd chosen money over family. But as I pulled into my driveway, another thought surfaced. Maybe that boy had been gone for longer than I'd wanted to admit. Maybe the man who could forge his father's signature and steal his house had been growing inside my son for years, fed by entitlement and enabled by my own reluctance to see what was happening. Inside the house, I went straight to my study and pulled out the photo albums Caroline had so meticulously maintained. Page after page of birthday parties and Christmas mornings, little league games and school plays, family vacations to the lake house that had been Caroline's pride and joy. In every picture, Ethan looked happy, loved, secure. But now I found myself studying those images differently, looking for signs I might have missed. The way his smile sometimes didn't reach his eyes, even as a child. The increasing frequency of requests for money as he got older. The way he'd begun bringing Madison to family gatherings even before they were engaged. As if he needed backup in dealing with his own parents. And Caroline's last Christmas, when she was already too weak to cook, but insisted on hosting dinner anyway. I remembered Ethan spending more time on his phone than with his dying mother. Remembered Madison complaining about the house being drafty, and suggesting we might be more comfortable in a restaurant. At the time, I'd attributed their behavior to grief and stress. Now, I wondered if they'd already been calculating the value of their inheritance. The phone rang, jarring me from my memories. Ethan's name appeared on the caller ID. "Dad, please don't hang up," he said before I could speak. "We need to talk about this. I think we've talked enough for one day." "No, listen. Madison and I have been discussing it, and we think we can work something out. We can get the loan transferred to our names, or maybe you could co-sign officially, just to make everything legal." The audacity of it took my breath away. He wanted me to legitimize his theft by co-signing for money he'd already stolen. "Ethan, do you have any idea what you've done? Do you understand that you've committed federal crimes?" "Dad, you're being dramatic. It's just paperwork. Families help each other out. Mom always said..." "Don't." The word came out sharper than I intended. "Don't you dare tell me what your mother would have said. Caroline would be heartbroken to see what you've become." There was silence on the other end of the line, then Madison's voice in the background, urgent and insistent, though I couldn't make out the words. "Look," Ethan said, his tone shifting to something harder, more calculating. "You can make this easy, or you can make this difficult. But either way, we need that money. Madison's parents are going to lose their apartment if we don't help them, and my job situation isn't as stable as I let on. You've got all this equity just sitting there, doing nothing. What's the point of hoarding wealth when your family needs help?" "Hoarding wealth?" I repeated. "You mean the money I earned by working 60-hour weeks for 40 years? The house I built with my own hands while you were playing Little League? That's not what I meant." "Yes, it is. That's exactly what you meant. You think I owe you something. You think because you're my son, you're entitled to everything I've worked for." "Aren't I?" The mask was slipping now, revealing something ugly underneath. "You can't take it with you, Dad. And it's not like you're using the house for anything important. You rattle around in there by yourself, talking to Mom's pictures. Maybe it's time to downsize anyway." The line went dead. He'd hung up on me. I sat in the silence of my study, surrounded by 47 years of marriage and 32 years of fatherhood, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. The last remnant of hope that this could be resolved amicably, that my son might find his way back to the values Caroline and I had tried to instill in him, finally died. Ethan had made his choice. He'd chosen money over family, greed over gratitude, betrayal over love. Now I would make mine. I reached for the phone and dialed Marcus's number. "Marcus, it's Richard. I've made my decision." "What do you want to do?" I looked around the study that Caroline had helped me design, at the built-in bookshelves I'd constructed to hold her collection of gardening books and romance novels, at the window that looked out on the backyard where we'd hosted countless barbecues and birthday parties. "I want to fight," I said, "and I want to win." "Good," Marcus said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "Let's teach your son what happens when you steal from the wrong man." As I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced in the 3 years since Caroline's death. Purpose. Clear, cold, unwavering purpose. My son thought he could take advantage of a grieving old man, thought he could steal my house and my security and my peace of mind. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. The boy I'd raised was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize and couldn't trust. But that was his choice to make. Mine was to protect what Caroline and I had built together, to ensure that our life's work didn't end up in the hands of someone who valued it only for what it could be sold for. The war Ethan had started was about to begin in earnest, and this time I intended to be the one left standing when the smoke cleared. The next morning, I woke before dawn, with the kind of clarity that comes after a sleepless night spent planning. The digital clock beside my bed read 4:47 a.m., but I felt more alert than I had in months. Purpose, it turned out, was better than caffeine for sharpening the mind. I made coffee in the kitchen, where Caroline used to hum while she cooked breakfast, where the morning light still fell across the table in those same golden stripes. But today, instead of sitting in contemplative silence, I spread Marcus's business card and my notebook across the oak surface and began making lists. At the top of the first page, I wrote evidence. Underneath, I cataloged everything I had: the forged loan documents, copies of my real signature from legitimate papers, photographs of the house during construction that proved I'd built it myself, bank records showing the original mortgage had been paid off 15 years ago. On the second page, timeline. March 15th, 2022, the day Caroline's will was finalized, the same day the fraudulent loan application was supposedly signed. I'd been at that meeting with Ethan, watching him take notes as the lawyer explained the inheritance procedures. Had he already been planning this theft, even while his mother lay dying? The third page was the most important: strategy. Marcus had explained my legal options, but I needed to think beyond just the law. Ethan wasn't just fighting me, he was fighting the truth, and truth had a way of surfacing when you knew where to dig. At 8 a.m. sharp, I called Catherine Mills, the mobile notary who had supposedly witnessed my signature on the loan documents. Her number was listed in the phone book, old-fashioned yellow pages that Caroline had insisted on keeping, even when everyone else had gone digital. "Mills Notary Services, this is Katie," came a cheerful voice that sounded younger than I'd expected. "Ms. Mills, this is Richard Dalton. I understand you notarized some documents for me about 18 months ago. A mortgage application?" There was a pause. "I notarize a lot of documents, Mr. Dalton. Can you give me some specifics?" March 15th, 2022. A loan application for First National Bank. "The thing is, Ms. Mills, I wasn't there. Someone else signed my name and claimed to be me." The cheerfulness vanished from her voice. "Sir, that's a very serious accusation. I always check identification carefully. I have copies of the driver's license I verified that day. I'd like to see those copies, and I'd like to know what the person who claimed to be me looked like." Another pause, longer this time. "Mr. Dalton, I think you should speak with my attorney." "I think you should speak with mine too. His name is Marcus Henley, and he'll be in touch." After I hung up, I sat back in my chair and smiled for the first time in 2 days. Katie Mills was scared, which meant she knew something was wrong with that notarization. Either she'd been sloppy about checking identification, or she'd been paid to look the other way. Either way, that was another crack in Ethan's story. Next, I called the credit reporting agencies. If Ethan had been using my identity for this mortgage, there might be other accounts, other debts I didn't know about. The automated systems transferred me from department to department, each one requiring me to prove I was who I claimed to be, which seemed ironic under the circumstances. By noon, I had credit reports from all 3 agencies spread across my kitchen table. Most of it was exactly what I expected. A few old accounts, my excellent payment history, the mortgage that had been satisfied in 2008. But there, listed under recent inquiries, were applications I'd never made, a credit card from Capital One, opened 6 months ago, a home equity line of credit from Regional Bank, also in my name. My hands shook as I reached for the phone to call these institutions. How deep did this betrayal go? How long had Ethan been stealing from me? The Capital One representative confirmed my worst fears. There was indeed a credit card in my name with a $15,000 limit, currently carrying a balance of $12,140. The card had been mailed to an address I didn't recognize, a P.O. box in the next town over. The home equity line of credit was even worse. Approved but not yet activated, it would give someone access to another $75,000 using my house as collateral. I hung up the phone and stared at the numbers I'd written down. Between the mortgage, the credit card, and the potential home equity loan, Ethan had put me on the hook for nearly $370,000. More than my house was worth. More than I could ever hope to repay on my pension and Social Security. The magnitude of the theft took my breath away. This wasn't desperation or a moment of poor judgment. This was systematic, calculated, and it had been going on for at least 18 months. While I'd been grieving Caroline's death and trying to maintain some connection with my son, he'd been methodically stealing my financial identity. I called Marcus immediately. "Richard, I was just about to call you. I've been doing some research on mortgage fraud cases, and I think we need to move faster than I initially thought." "It's worse than we knew," I said, and told him about the credit card and the home equity line. Marcus's silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, he spoke. "Richard, this is organized financial crime. We're not talking about a single bad decision anymore. We're talking about a pattern of identity theft that could have destroyed your financial life completely. What do we do?" "First, we file police reports for all of it. Every account, every application, every forged signature. Second, we get restraining orders to prevent any further use of your identity. Third, we demand that every penny be returned immediately, and if it's not, we file criminal charges. And Ethan, Ethan is looking at federal prison time. Multiple felonies, Richard. The prosecutors will throw the book at him. I should have felt satisfaction at that news, but all I felt was a deep, weary sadness. The boy who used to help me stack firewood for winter had become someone who could steal his father's entire life savings without apparent remorse. That afternoon, I drove to the police station, a low brick building that had been expanded twice since I'd first moved to Clearwater, but still retained the small-town atmosphere where everyone knew everyone else's business. Detective Sarah Chen, a woman about Ethan's age with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, listened to my story while taking careful notes. "Mr. Dalton, I have to ask, is there any possibility that you signed these documents and forgot? Sometimes older adults—" "Detective, I'm 70 years old, not 90. My memory is fine, and I've never had any cognitive issues." I pulled out the comparison sheets Marcus had prepared, showing my real signature beside the forged ones. "Look at these closely. The person who signed my name was good, but not perfect." She studied the documents with a magnifying glass, comparing the subtle differences in letter formation and pen pressure. "You're right, these are definitely forgeries, and sophisticated ones. Whoever did this had access to multiple examples of your real signature. My son, he's seen me sign thousands of documents over the years. Birthday cards, Christmas checks, insurance papers." Detective Chen's expression grew grim. "Mr. Dalton, I need to warn you that cases like this, when they involve family members, can get very ugly very quickly. Are you prepared for what might happen if we arrest your son?" I thought about Ethan as a child, running to me when he scraped his knee, trusting me to make everything better. I thought about Caroline at his high school graduation, tears in her eyes as she watched our boy walk across the stage. I thought about all the dreams we'd had for his future, all the hopes we'd invested in the man we thought he'd become. "Detective, my son stopped being my family the moment he decided to steal my house. Do whatever the law requires." She nodded slowly. "I'll start the paperwork. But, Mr. Dalton, you should know that identity theft cases can take months to resolve, sometimes longer. In the meantime, you're still liable for these debts unless we can prove fraud to the satisfaction of the financial institutions. Then we'd better prove it." On the drive home, I made one more stop, at Henderson Hardware, the store where I'd bought supplies for countless home improvement projects over the years. Tom Henderson was behind the counter, as he had been for 30 years, his weathered hands and ready smile a constant in a world that seemed to be changing too fast. "Richard, good to see you. What can I help you with today?" "I need to upgrade my home security, Tom. Cameras, motion sensors, better locks, the works." Tom's bushy eyebrows rose. "Everything all right?" "Let's just say I want to make sure I know who's coming and going from my property." He led me to the back of the store, where displays of modern security equipment sat next to more traditional hardware. "These wireless cameras are pretty slick," he said, picking up a small device no bigger than a deck of cards. "Hook up to your Wi-Fi, send alerts to your phone. You can watch your house from anywhere." I bought a complete system, 6 cameras, motion detectors, a digital recorder, and new deadbolt locks for every door. Tom offered to install everything, but I declined. This was something I needed to do myself, something that would give me back a sense of control over my own property. That evening, I worked until well past midnight, mounting cameras and running cables, programming motion sensors and testing alert systems. The physical labor felt good after days of emotional turmoil, my hands remembering the satisfaction of building something useful, something protective. When I finally finished, I had complete visual coverage of my property. Anyone approaching the house would be recorded from multiple angles. More importantly, anyone trying to enter without permission would trigger alerts sent directly to my phone. I sat in Caroline's chair in the living room, watching the feeds from all 6 cameras on my laptop screen. The house that had been our sanctuary for 37 years was now a fortress, protected against intrusion by our own son. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my life building walls to keep strangers out. Now I was building them to keep family out too. But as I watched the peaceful images of my yard in the moonlight, each camera standing sentinel against further betrayal, I felt something I hadn't experienced since that phone call from the bank. Security. Tomorrow, Marcus would file the legal papers that would begin the process of reclaiming my stolen identity. Detective Chen would pursue criminal charges that might send Ethan to prison. The credit reporting agencies would begin the long process of removing fraudulent accounts from my record. But tonight, for the first time in days, I was going to sleep peacefully in my own bed, in the house I'd built with my own hands, protected by systems I'd installed myself. Let Ethan and Madison plan their next move. Let them scheme and strategize and justify their theft. I was ready for whatever came next. The boy I'd raised might be gone, but the man who'd built this life from nothing was still here. And he wasn't going to be an easy target for anyone, family or otherwise. Some lessons I was learning could only be taught the hard way, and school was about to begin. The call came at 6:43 a.m. on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after I'd installed the security system. I was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with my coffee and the morning paper, when my phone buzzed with a motion alert. Someone was walking up my driveway. I pulled up the camera feed on my laptop and watched Ethan approach my front door. He moved differently than I remembered, shoulders hunched, head down, like a man carrying weight he couldn't set down. Behind him, Madison followed at a distance, her usual confidence replaced by something that looked like fear. They knocked, and I let them wait. Let them wonder if I was home, if I was watching, if I was preparing for exactly this moment. Because I was. When I finally opened the door, Ethan's face showed surprise at how quickly I'd answered, as if he'd expected me to be caught off guard. But those days were over. "Dad," he said, his voice carrying that forced brightness people use when they're trying to pretend everything is normal. "We need to talk." "No," I said simply. "We don't." Madison stepped forward, her carefully applied makeup unable to hide the dark circles under her eyes. "Richard, please, we're family. We can work through this." "Family," I repeated, tasting the word like something bitter. "Is that what you call it when you steal someone's house?" "We've been talking to a lawyer," Ethan said quickly. "There might be a way to resolve this without involving the police. A payment plan, maybe, or we could sign the house over to you officially and work out the mortgage." "You want to sign my house over to me?" I couldn't help but laugh, though there was no humor in it. "That's generous, considering it was already mine. Dad, the situation is more complicated than you understand. Madison's parents are about to be evicted. My job, the promotion I mentioned, it fell through. We're facing bankruptcy if we can't." "Stop." I held up a hand. "Just stop. I don't want to hear about your financial problems, because they're not my financial problems. They became your problems the moment you decided to forge my signature." Madison's composure finally cracked. "You're being cruel. We made a mistake, but destroying your son's life isn't going to fix anything." "I'm not destroying anything. I'm protecting what's mine." I stepped back to close the door. "If you want to discuss this further, you can talk to my attorney." "Dad, wait." Ethan put his foot in the door, preventing me from closing it. For a moment, our eyes met, and I saw something desperate there, something that reminded me of the boy who used to have nightmares and climb into our bed for comfort. But then I remembered the credit card bills, the forged signatures, the systematic theft that had been going on for 18 months, and the momentary sympathy hardened into resolve. "Move your foot, Ethan. What if we could pay some of it back? Not all at once, but over time? We could work out a plan." "With what money? The money you stole from me? We'll figure something out. I'll get another job. Madison's parents can help." "Madison's parents who are about to be evicted? They're going to help you pay back nearly $400,000? The number hung in the air between us like a slap. Ethan's face went pale. $400,000! Dad, the mortgage was only $280,000. The mortgage, the credit card, the home equity line you applied for. Did you think I wouldn't find out about all of it?" I pulled out the folder I'd prepared, thick with printouts and bank statements. 18 months of systematic identity theft. 18 months of you stealing from your father while I was still grieving your mother. Madison made a sound like a sob. Ethan just stared at the papers, his mouth opening and closing without sound. "You want to know what really hurts?" I continued, my voice steady despite the storm inside my chest. "It's not just the money, it's that you planned this while your mother was dying. You sat in that lawyer's office listening to her will being read, and you were already scheming about how to steal my house." "It wasn't like that." "Then what was it like? Explain to me how a son looks at his grieving father and sees a mark to be conned." Ethan's foot moved away from the door, his shoulders sagging in defeat. "I never meant for it to go this far. It was supposed to be temporary, just until I got back on my feet. 18 months, Ethan. 18 months of systematic theft. That's not temporary, that's a lifestyle. I closed the door and watched through the security camera as they walked back to their car, Madison crying openly now, Ethan moving like a man in a daze. They sat in the driveway for several minutes, having what looked like an intense conversation, before finally driving away. My phone rang an hour later. Marcus. Richard, I just got a call from a lawyer named Jennifer Walsh. She says she represents your son and wants to discuss a settlement. What kind of settlement? Payment plan, reduced penalties, no criminal charges, the usual. And what did you tell her? I told her we weren't interested in settlements. We want full restitution and criminal prosecution. Marcus paused. Richard, are you sure about this? Once we go down this road, there's no going back. I looked around the kitchen where Caroline had cooked thousands of meals, where she'd balanced our checkbook and planned our retirement and dreamed about the grandchildren she'd never lived to see, where she'd fought her last battle with cancer while our son was already planning to steal the house she'd die in. I'm sure, I said. The next phase of Marcus's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of just defending against Ethan's fraud, we went on the offensive. Marcus filed civil suits against not just Ethan and Madison, but against the bank that had failed to properly verify the loan application, against Katie Mills, the notary who had been negligent in her duties, and against Regional Bank for approving a home equity line without adequate verification. The beauty of this approach, Marcus explained as we sat in his office reviewing the filings, is that it puts everyone on the defensive. The banks don't want the liability, so they'll cooperate fully with the criminal investigation. The notary doesn't want to lose her license, so she'll admit to cutting corners. And your son will find himself facing not just criminal charges, but civil lawsuits from multiple parties. How long will this take? Months, maybe longer. But, Richard, I think we can accelerate the timeline if we're smart about it. Marcus pulled out a thick folder. I've been doing some research on your son's financial situation. Did you know he's been living beyond his means for years? The house he and Madison live in is mortgaged to the hilt. They lease their cars. They have credit card debt approaching 6 figures. And from what I can tell, their monthly expenses exceed their income by a significant margin. So they're broke. Worse than broke. They're living in a house of cards that's about to collapse. The mortgage fraud was probably a desperate attempt to stave off bankruptcy. And when people are desperate, they make mistakes. Exactly. Marcus smiled, the expression of a chess player who could see several moves ahead. I think your son is about to make some very poor decisions. He was right. 3 days later, Detective Chen called to inform me that Ethan had been arrested trying to access the home equity line of credit. He'd walked into Regional Bank with forged authorization documents, claiming I'd sent him to activate the account on my behalf. The bank manager got suspicious when he couldn't reach you at the phone number on file, Detective Chen explained. Turns out your son had listed his own cell phone as your contact number. When they called to verify, he answered claiming to be you. He impersonated me over the phone? Badly. The bank manager had dealt with you before and knew your voice. They stalled him while security called us. I should have felt vindicated, but all I felt was tired. Tired of the lies, tired of the betrayal, tired of watching my son dig himself deeper into a hole he'd never climb out of. What happens now? He's been charged with identity theft, fraud, and attempted fraud. With his prior acts, the district attorney is talking about federal charges. Your son is looking at serious prison time, Mr. Dalton. That evening, I sat in Caroline's chair in the living room, looking at the photographs that lined the mantelpiece. Our wedding day, Ethan's first steps, family vacations to the lake house, Christmas mornings filled with laughter and hope. When had it all gone wrong? When had the boy in those pictures become someone I no longer recognized? The phone rang. Madison. Richard, please. You have to help us. Ethan is in jail, and they're saying he might not get bail. They're treating him like some kind of criminal mastermind. Madison, he is a criminal. He stole nearly $400,000 using my identity. It was my fault, she said, her voice breaking. I pushed him into it. My parents needed help, and we were so far behind on our bills. And I kept telling him that you had all this money just sitting there doing nothing. So you convinced him to steal from me. I convinced him to borrow from you. We were going to pay it back, I swear. We just needed time to get back on our feet. 18 months, Madison. How much time did you need? She was crying now, the kind of desperate sobs that come when someone realizes their world is crumbling. Richard, I know we hurt you. I know we broke your trust. But please, don't let them send him to prison. He's your son. No, I said quietly. My son died the day he decided to steal from me. The man in that jail cell is a stranger who happens to share my DNA. I hung up and sat in the growing darkness, surrounded by the ghosts of better times. Outside, the security cameras maintained their silent vigil, protecting me from further intrusion. Inside, the house that Caroline and I had filled with love and laughter felt cavernous and empty. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something approaching peace. Not happiness, I doubted I'd feel that again for a long time. But peace, the kind that comes when you stop fighting the current and let the river carry you where it needs to go. Ethan had made his choices. Now he would live with the consequences. And I would live with mine, in the house I'd built with my own hands, surrounded by memories of the woman who'd made it a home and protected from those who would steal even that. The war was almost over. Soon, there would be nothing left but the quiet satisfaction of justice served and the long, slow process of learning to live with the wreckage of a family that had once meant everything. Some bridges once burned could never be rebuilt. But sometimes that was exactly what needed to happen. The courthouse in downtown Clearwater hadn't changed much since I'd gotten married there 47 years ago. The same limestone steps, the same heavy oak doors, the same sense of weight and permanence that comes with buildings designed to outlast the people who use them. But walking up those steps on a cold November morning, I felt like I was entering a different world entirely, one where fathers testified against sons and family bonds dissolved in courtrooms. Marcus met me at the security checkpoint, his usual confident demeanor tempered by something that looked like sympathy. Richard, you don't have to be here for this. The plea hearing is largely procedural. I want to see it, I said, handing my keys to the security guard. I want to watch him admit what he did. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with maybe 50 seats and the kind of fluorescent lighting that made everyone look pale and tired. A handful of other cases were scheduled ahead of Ethan's, minor traffic violations, a DUI, a domestic disturbance, the routine business of a county court dealing with people who'd made poor choices. When they brought Ethan in, I almost didn't recognize him. The orange jumpsuit hung loose on his frame, and he'd lost weight during his 3 weeks in jail. His hair was unwashed, and he had the hollow look of someone who'd stopped sleeping well. But it was his posture that struck me most. Shoulders hunched, head down, moving like a man who'd finally understood the full weight of his actions. Madison sat 2 rows behind the defendant's table, flanked by her parents. She looked as bad as Ethan, her usual polished appearance replaced by rumpled clothes and red-rimmed eyes. When she saw me enter the courtroom, she half rose from her seat, mouth opening as if to speak, but her father pulled her back down. "All rise," the bailiff called as Judge Patricia Hawkins entered. I'd known Pat Hawkins for 20 years. She'd been a young prosecutor when Caroline and I had dealt with some property disputes in the 80s. And her reputation for fairness was matched only by her intolerance for criminal behavior. The proceedings were exactly as Marcus had predicted, procedural, clinical, stripped of emotion. Ethan's lawyer, a tired-looking public defender named Robert Kim, stood to address the court. "Your Honor, my client wishes to enter a plea of guilty to charges of identity theft in the first degree, mortgage fraud, and criminal impersonation. In exchange for this plea, the state has agreed to recommend a sentence of 5 to 7 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after 3 years. 5 to 7 years. The numbers hit me harder than I'd expected. My son, who'd once asked me to read him bedtime stories and help him with homework, was going to spend the better part of a decade behind bars. Judge Hawkins reviewed the file, her expression neutral. "Mr. Dalton, do you understand the charges against you?" Ethan stood slowly, his voice barely audible. "Yes, Your Honor. And do you understand that by pleading guilty, you're admitting to committing these crimes and waiving your right to a trial?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Before I accept this plea, I need to understand the nature of your crimes. Can you tell the court, in your own words, what you did?" Ethan was silent for a long moment, his hands clasped in front of him. When he finally spoke, His voice was thick with emotion. "I forged my father's signature on loan documents. I used his personal information to take out a mortgage on his house without his knowledge or permission. I also opened a credit card in his name and applied for a home equity line of credit. I did this because I was in financial trouble, and I thought I could pay it back before he found out." "And how much money was involved?" "Approximately $370,000, Your Honor." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Even for people accustomed to criminal proceedings, the amount was staggering. "Mr. Dalton, this wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. The evidence shows this behavior continued for over 18 months. Can you explain that to the court?" Ethan's composure finally cracked. "I kept thinking I could fix it. Every month I told myself I'd get caught up, that I'd find a way to make the payments and pay everything back. But things kept getting worse, and I kept taking more. From your father." "Yes, Your Honor, from my father." Judge Hawkins leaned back in her chair, studying Ethan with the kind of penetrating gaze that seemed to see through whatever masks people wore into courtrooms. "Mr. Dalton, in my 20 years on this bench, I've seen a lot of financial crimes. But I have to say, stealing from your own parent, putting their home and security at risk while they're grieving the loss of their spouse, that shows a level of callousness that troubles me deeply." Ethan's shoulders shook, but he didn't respond. "However, I'm going to accept your guilty plea because it spares your father the trauma of a trial, and because your cooperation with law enforcement has helped recover some of the stolen funds." She paused. "I'm sentencing you to 6 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after 4 years. You're also ordered to pay full restitution to your father in the amount of $378,412, including interest and penalties." The gavel came down with finality that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. 6 years, 4 years before he could even hope for parole. As the bailiff moved to escort Ethan back to holding, he turned and looked directly at me for the first time since entering the courtroom. His eyes were filled with tears, his mouth moving as if he wanted to say something. But what was there to say? What words could bridge the gap between the father, who'd built him a treehouse, and the son, who'd stolen his house? I stood and walked out of the courtroom without looking back. In the hallway, Madison caught up with me, her heels clicking frantically on the marble floor. "Richard, wait, please." I stopped, turning to face her. Up close, she looked even worse than she had in the courtroom, hollow-eyed, desperate, aged beyond her 30 years. "He's sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "He's so sorry for what he did. He never meant for it to go this far. Madison, intentions don't matter anymore. Actions do, and his actions put my home at risk while I was grieving my wife. I know, but he's still your son. Doesn't that count for something?" I studied her face. This woman who'd convinced my boy that stealing from his father was acceptable, who'd pushed him toward decisions that had destroyed our family. "No," I said quietly. "It doesn't. Not anymore." Her face crumpled, but I was already walking away, Marcus beside me, our footsteps echoing in the grand hallway of a building designed to dispense justice. Outside, the November air was sharp and clean after the stifling atmosphere of the courtroom. I breathed deeply, feeling lighter than I had in months. "How do you feel?" Marcus asked as we descended the courthouse steps. "Empty," I said honestly, but not in a bad way. Empty like a house after you've cleaned out all the broken furniture. "The restitution order is largely symbolic, you know. Ethan won't be able to pay anywhere near that amount, even after he gets out." "I know, but it's on the record now. The full extent of what he stole from me is documented forever." We reached my truck, and I paused with my hand on the door handle. Across the street, Madison was helping her parents into their car, all three of them moving with the defeated posture of people who'd just watched their carefully constructed world collapse. "Marcus, I want to do something with the house." "What do you mean?" "I want to set up a trust. When I die, I don't want the house going to Ethan, not after this." Marcus nodded slowly. "I can help you with that. Do you have any thoughts about who should inherit it?" I thought about Caroline's volunteer work at the Veterans Center, how she'd spent her Saturdays making care packages for soldiers overseas, how she'd believed the service to others was the highest calling a person could have. The Veterans Association, they're always looking for places to house people transitioning back to civilian life. Caroline would have liked that. A good choice. We can structure it so you retain full control during your lifetime, but after your death, the property would go to help veterans. Driving home through the familiar streets of Clearwater, I felt a strange sense of completion. The legal proceedings were over, justice had been served, and my son was paying the price for his betrayal. But more than that, I had reclaimed not just my financial security, but my sense of self-worth. For months after Caroline's death, I'd felt like half a person, diminished by loss and uncertain of my place in a world that suddenly seemed too large and empty. Ethan's betrayal had threatened to finish what grief had started, to reduce me to nothing more than a victim of my own family's greed. But fighting back had reminded me who I was, not just a grieving widower or a foolish old man who'd trusted the wrong people. I was Richard Dalton, a man who'd built a life with his own hands, who'd served his country and raised a family, and constructed a business through decades of honest work. I was someone who didn't give up, who didn't roll over when threatened, who protected what mattered. The house looked different when I pulled into the driveway, not just because of the security cameras I'd installed, but because it felt truly mine again. Not just legally, though that mattered, but emotionally. This was my sanctuary, my refuge, my connection to Caroline and to the life we'd built together. Inside, I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table where this whole nightmare had begun with a phone call from a confused bank representative. The manila envelope full of fraudulent documents still sat in the corner where I'd left it, but now it felt like evidence of a battle won rather than a wound that wouldn't heal. The phone rang. I almost didn't answer, but the caller ID showed a number I recognized, Detective Chen. Mr. Dalton, I wanted to let you know that we've recovered about $40,000 from your son's accounts. It's not much compared to what he stole, but it's something. Thank you, Detective. I appreciate everything you've done. There's one more thing. During the investigation, we discovered that your son had been researching how to change the deed on your house. He had printouts of legal forms, information about quiet title actions, even correspondence with a lawyer about transferring property from elderly parents. This wasn't just financial desperation, Mr. Dalton. He was planning to steal your house outright. The revelation should have shocked me, but instead I felt only a weary confirmation of what I'd already suspected. Ethan hadn't just been stealing money. He'd been planning to take everything. Would Caroline and I have been left homeless? Based on what we found, it looks like he was planning to force you into some kind of assisted living situation, make you think you couldn't handle living alone anymore. After I hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my kitchen, processing this final betrayal. My son hadn't just wanted my money. He'd wanted my independence, my dignity, my right to live in the house I'd built. He'd been planning to gaslight me into believing I was too old, too frail, too confused to manage my own life. But as the shock wore off, I felt something unexpected. Gratitude. Gratitude that I'd discovered the truth before it was too late. Gratitude that I'd fought back instead of quietly accepting what was happening. Gratitude that Caroline hadn't lived to see what our son had become. I made myself a simple dinner and ate it at the table where Caroline and I had shared thousands of meals, where we'd planned our retirement and dreamed about the future, where she'd fought her last battle with cancer, while our son was already scheming to steal the house she'd die in. The irony wasn't lost on me. In trying to destroy me, Ethan had actually freed me from the guilt of not doing enough to maintain our relationship, from the worry that I was somehow failing as a father, from the obligation to sacrifice my own well-being for the sake of family peace. I was 70 years old, a widower living alone in a house full of memories. But I wasn't a victim. I wasn't broken. I wasn't defeated. I was exactly where I belonged, surrounded by the life Caroline and I had built together, protected by laws I'd used wisely and justice I'd fought for honestly. Some people might see that as a lonely existence. But as I washed my dinner dishes and prepared for another peaceful evening in my own home, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Caroline's death. Contentment. The boy I'd raised was gone, replaced by a man I no longer recognized or claimed. But that was his choice to make. Mine was to live the rest of my life with dignity, surrounded by memories of love, rather than burdened by obligations to people who would steal even those memories if given the chance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new opportunities to build something meaningful with whatever time I had left. But tonight, I was simply going to sit in Caroline's chair, look at her photographs, and appreciate the profound peace that comes from knowing you've protected what matters most. The war was over, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I had won. 3 months after the sentencing, I received a letter, not delivered by the postman, but slipped under my front door sometime during the night. The security cameras had caught a figure in a dark coat approaching around 2 a.m., but the face was hidden beneath a hood, and they'd moved quickly enough to avoid clear identification. The envelope had my name written in Madison's careful script, the same handwriting that had once addressed Christmas cards and birthday invitations when we'd still been a family. I almost threw it away without opening it. Almost. But curiosity won out over caution, and I found myself sitting at Caroline's desk, sliding my finger under the sealed flap. Dear Richard, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and I understand why. What Ethan and I did to you was unforgivable. I've thought about that word a lot lately, unforgivable, and I think I'm finally beginning to understand what it really means. I'm writing this from my parents' apartment. We lost the house last week. The bank foreclosed after we couldn't make payments, and everything we owned is gone. I guess that's justice in a way. We tried to steal your house, and now we have no house at all. My parents blame me for everything that's happened. They say I corrupted Ethan, turned him against his family, destroyed their chance at a comfortable retirement. They're not wrong. I did push him toward what we did. I was the one who looked at your house and saw dollar signs instead of a home. I was the one who convinced him that you were just hoarding wealth while your family struggled. But that's not the real reason I'm writing. I'm writing because I need you to know that Ethan talks about you every day. In his letters from prison, in our phone calls, in his dreams that he tells me about. He's not asking for forgiveness. He knows he doesn't deserve it. He's just broken, completely broken by what he did to you. He told me about the fishing trips you used to take when he was little, how you taught him to tie knots and read water and be patient. He said you always told him that fishing wasn't about catching fish. It was about learning to be still with yourself, to be comfortable with silence and your own thoughts. He says the hardest part of prison isn't the other inmates or the guards or the terrible food. It's the silence. Because when everything gets quiet, all he can think about is how he destroyed the only father he'll ever have. I'm not asking you to forgive him. I'm not asking you to visit or write or acknowledge that he exists. I just thought you should know that the man who stole from you is suffering for it every single day. Maybe that gives you some satisfaction. Maybe it doesn't matter to you at all. But I needed to tell someone, and you're the only person who would understand the weight of what we lost. I'm moving back to my sister's place in Oregon next week. Starting over, I suppose, though I'm not sure people like me get to start over. People who steal from family, people who poison everything they touch. I hope you're well, Richard. I hope you're finding peace in that beautiful house that we never deserved to set foot in. I hope Caroline's memory brings you comfort, and I hope you can remember the good times with Ethan without the pain of what came after overshadowing everything. I'm sorry for all of it, for every dollar, every lie, every moment of trust we betrayed. I know sorry isn't enough, but it's all I have left to give. Madison. I read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in the fireproof box where I kept Caroline's important papers. Not because I wanted to preserve it, but because it felt like the final piece of evidence in a case that was finally closed. Outside, March had come early to Clearwater, bringing the kind of soft warmth that makes you remember why you fell in love with spring in the first place. Caroline's garden was beginning to show signs of life, crocuses pushing through the last patches of snow, the forsythia bush showing the faint green of new buds. I'd been working in the garden more lately, partly because the physical labor felt good after months of sitting in lawyers' offices and courtrooms, but mostly because it was something Caroline and I had shared, something that connected me to her memory without the taint of betrayal that now colored every thought of Ethan. The Veterans Association had been enthusiastic about my plan to donate the house after my death. The director, a Vietnam veteran named Jake Morrison, had visited several times to discuss how the property might be used. It would make an ideal transitional housing facility, he'd said, walking through the rooms Caroline had decorated with such care. Private enough for guys who need space to decompress, but close enough to town for job interviews and medical appointments. Your wife had good instincts about what makes a place feel like home. I'd started making changes with that future in mind, updating the electrical system, replacing the old furnace, making sure the foundation was solid enough to support the house for decades to come. Not because I was eager to leave, but because I wanted to ensure that when my time came, the house would be ready to serve a purpose Caroline would have approved of. The work gave my days structure and meaning in a way I hadn't experienced since retiring. Each project was a small act of preservation, a way of extending the useful life of something I'd built with love and maintained with pride. I was replacing rotted deck boards on a warm April afternoon when Tom Henderson from the hardware store stopped by with a delivery of stain. "Richard, you're making the rest of us look bad," he said, surveying the neat piles of lumber and the precision of my work. "This deck's going to outlast both of us." "That's the idea," I said, setting down my circular saw. "Want some coffee?" I was about to take a break anyway. We sat on the newly repaired deck, drinking coffee and watching a red-winged blackbird investigate Caroline's bird feeder. The conversation meandered through local gossip, the upcoming mayoral election, and Tom's grandson's college baseball prospects. "Can I ask you something personal?" Tom said eventually. "Shoot. Do you ever regret it, pressing charges against Ethan?" I'd been asked variations of this question dozens of times over the past few months, by neighbors, by people at the grocery store, by well-meaning friends who couldn't understand how a father could send his son to prison. Each time, I gave the same answer. "No," I said. "I regret that it was necessary. I regret that my son became someone who could steal from his father, but I don't regret protecting myself and honoring Caroline's memory." Tom nodded slowly. "My brother went through something similar with his daughter a few years back. Not identity theft, but she was stealing money from his business, forging checks. He covered for her, made excuses, kept bailing her out." He paused. "She overdosed last Christmas. Heroin bought with money she'd stolen from him. I'm sorry." He blames himself, says if he'd been tougher earlier, gotten her into treatment instead of enabling her, she might still be alive. Tom set down his coffee mug. "Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is let them face the consequences of their actions." After Tom left, I returned to my work on the deck, his words echoing in my mind. Had I been kind to Ethan by refusing to enable his theft? Was prison the wake-up call he needed to finally change his life? Or was I just telling myself stories to make peace with the hardest decision I'd ever made? The truth was, I'd probably never know. The man in that orange jumpsuit wasn't the boy I'd raised, and he might never become someone I could recognize as my son again. But that was his journey to make, his choices to live with, his redemption to earn or forfeit. Mine was simpler, to live with dignity in the house I'd built, to honor Caroline's memory through the work of my hands, and to ensure that when my time came, I'd leave behind something useful rather than just more pain. As the sun set behind the oak tree Ethan and I had planted 30 years ago, I cleaned my tools and put them away with the same care Caroline had taught me to show for everything valuable. Tomorrow I'd start on the bathroom renovation, updating fixtures that were older than Madison and improving accessibility for whatever veterans might eventually call this place home. The work would continue until my hands were too stiff to hold a hammer or my back too bent to swing one effectively. And when that day came, I'd sit on this deck I'd just repaired and watch the seasons change over the garden Caroline had designed, content in the knowledge that I'd spent my remaining years building rather than brooding, creating rather than destroying. The boy who'd helped me plant that oak tree was gone, lost to choices I couldn't control and consequences I couldn't prevent. But the tree remained, growing stronger each year, its roots deep in soil I'd prepared with my own hands. Some things endured, some things kept faith. Some things remained worth the effort of protection and preservation. As I locked the door and turned on the security system that had become as routine as brushing my teeth, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from a day well spent in service of something larger than immediate comfort. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to build something lasting. Tonight, I would sleep peacefully in the house I'd defended, surrounded by memories of the woman who'd made it a home, protected by justice I'd fought for, and earned through courage I'd nearly forgotten I possessed. The quiet after the storm was deeper than any silence I'd known, And in that quietness, finally, I found something approaching peace. Comment one word that describes how you feel after watching.